You're about to hear 4 true scary stories from Border Patrol agents. Story 1. The sensor that wasn't there. Rolando had worked a remote sector of desert terrain for 9 years, mostly nights. The desert at night was a different world from the desert during the day. Cooler, quieter, and strange, in a way that took most agents a full season to get used to. The silence out there had a texture to it, he said. Something you could almost feel pressing against your ears after enough hours alone in it. He worked out of a small substation that covered close to 40 miles of rugged, mostly unpopulated terrain, canyon systems and dry washes and long stretches of open desert broken up by rocky outcroppings that could hide a person or a vehicle within a matter of seconds. The terrain was monitored through a network of ground sensors buried at known crossing points, motion-triggered and wired back to a central console at the station, giving agents in the field a rough sense of where activity was occurring before they arrived to confirm it visually. The sensors were old technology by the time Rolando started, reliable but occasionally temperamental. False triggers happened. Wildlife, wind-blown brush, temperature shifts in the ground that the older units sometimes misread as movement. Everyone who worked that sector had a mental list of which sensors were trustworthy and which ones cried wolf. Sensor 41 had always been reliable. It sat at a natural crossing point where a dry wash narrowed between 2 low ridges, a geographically obvious choke point that made it one of the more consistently useful sensors in the entire network. This happened on a Wednesday night in September, still hot enough after dark that the desert held its heat until close to midnight. The kind of night where the air felt thick, even standing still, the ground beneath his boots still radiating warmth absorbed from a full day of relentless sun. Rolando was on solo patrol, working a stretch of terrain that included Sensor 41, when the console radioed an activation. He acknowledged and started toward the location, a rocky wash about 2 miles from his current position, following a route he'd driven 100 times before. Familiar enough that he could navigate most of it without needing to think closely about the terrain. He was still about 10 minutes out, driving carefully over the uneven terrain, when the console radioed again with an update. Second activation, same sensor, 30 seconds after the first. That in itself wasn't unusual at all. Groups moving through a wash sometimes triggered a sensor more than once, in quick succession, as different individual members of the group crossed the same narrow point in the terrain, a few seconds apart from one another. He kept driving. He was about 5 minutes out when the console called a third time. Third activation, same sensor. This time, the dispatcher's voice had a slightly different quality to it, something Rolando picked up on immediately, even over the radio. He asked what was different, keeping his voice level despite the small note of concern he'd caught in hers. The dispatcher said the sensor had activated a third time, but this time it hadn't stopped. It was reading continuous movement, which the sensors weren't built to do. They triggered on a threshold crossing, then reset, a simple binary function that had worked reliably for years. A continuous signal meant either a malfunction or something moving back and forth directly across the sensor's zone, repeatedly, without ever fully leaving it, which in practical terms didn't correspond to any normal way a person or group actually moved through terrain. Rolando arrived at the wash a few minutes later, tires crunching over loose gravel as he slowed to a stop and swung his spotlight across the terrain. Nothing. Empty terrain in every direction his spotlight could reach. No group, no vehicle tracks, no footprints in the soft sand of the wash bed that would explain a continuous motion signal. Nothing but rock and scattered brush, and the kind of stillness that felt, in that moment, slightly too complete. He radioed the console and asked for a status update. The dispatcher told him the sensor was still reading active movement. Right now, while Rolando was standing directly on top of it, he looked down at his own boots, at the exact spot the sensor was buried, and felt a specific kind of cold that had nothing to do with the desert night. He asked the dispatcher to repeat that, needing to hear it a second time before he could fully process what she was telling him. She repeated it, her tone carrying the same edge of confusion he was now feeling himself. Sensor 41, continuous activation, ongoing right now, in real time, at his current location. the exact coordinates matching where his own vehicle was parked. He was the only person there. He looked around slowly, spotlight sweeping the terrain again, confirming what he already knew to be true, the same empty wash he'd been standing in for several minutes now. He stepped back from the spot slowly, watching the ground like it might do something visible, though nothing about buried ground sensor technology worked that way, and he knew it. He asked the dispatcher, his voice quieter now than he intended, if the reading had changed at all. She said no. Still active, right now, while you're standing there. The console, she said, was showing continuous activity at his exact coordinates, without pause or interruption. He stood there for almost 2 minutes, alone in the dark, watching an empty stretch of wash that a sensor insisted was currently occupied by something moving, his flashlight beam sweeping slowly across ground that showed nothing but undisturbed sand and scattered rock. The reading finally stopped on its own, without explanation, 4 minutes after he'd first arrived at the wash, the console going quiet as abruptly as it had first alerted him, leaving him standing there in a silence that felt, for the first time in 9 years of desert nights, genuinely unfamiliar. Rolando filed an equipment malfunction report, the standard procedure for an unexplained reading, describing the incident as precisely as he could while leaving out the parts that felt too strange to put into an official document, and a technician was sent out the following week to inspect the unit. The technician spent the better part of an afternoon out at Sensor 41, running diagnostics, checking every connection and component with the kind of thoroughness that suggested he took the report seriously despite the unusual nature of the complaint. He found nothing wrong with it, tested it thoroughly, replaced the battery as routine maintenance anyway, and confirmed it was functioning within normal parameters, exactly as designed, with no indication of the malfunction that would have been necessary to produce the reading Rolando had witnessed. Rolando asked him, half joking in an attempt to lighten a conversation that had started to feel heavier than he wanted it to be, whether the sensor could somehow read a presence that wasn't physically, visibly there. The technician didn't laugh. He set down his tools and thought about the question seriously for a moment before answering. He said he'd heard something similar from another agent, years earlier, about a different sensor in a different sector entirely, on the opposite side of the region from where Rolando worked. Continuous activation, no visible cause, resolving on its own after several minutes, almost exactly matching what Rolando had just described. Rolando asked what had caused it in that case, hoping for some concrete answer he could hold on to. The technician said nobody had ever figured that one out either, and that the agent who'd reported it had eventually stopped mentioning it altogether, the way people sometimes did with things that had no satisfying explanation. He continued working that sector for the remaining 4 years of his assignment there, requesting, without ever fully explaining why, to keep Sensor 41 on his own regular patrol route, rather than handing that section off to another agent. Sensor 41 never gave him a false reading again, not once in all that time, and he checked its logs obsessively for a long while afterward, scrolling back through weeks of clean, unremarkable data, half expecting a repeat that never came. There was something almost worse, he said, about the sensor behaving perfectly normally after that night, as if it had simply chosen that one specific evening, out of thousands of nights of otherwise flawless operation, to report something no explanation could account for. He asked around the station, carefully, without fully explaining why he was asking, whether anyone else had experienced anything unusual with their sensors over the years. Most agents laughed it off or had nothing to report beyond the usual false triggers from wildlife. One older agent, close to retirement, told him quietly that every sector had at least one spot like that, a place where the equipment occasionally reported something the terrain itself couldn't explain. He said you learned, eventually, not to ask too many questions about it, and to simply note it in the log and move on with your shift. He told me he still thinks about those 4 minutes sometimes, standing alone in an empty wash, while a piece of buried equipment insisted, with total confidence, that he wasn't as alone as he appeared to be. He said the worst part wasn't the reading itself. It was standing there afterward, in the silence, waiting to see if it would happen again, and realizing he had no way of knowing, one way or another, whether it already had. Story 2. The Voice on Channel 4. This particular story comes from a woman named Adela, who worked communications and dispatch for a remote sector station for just over 7 years, before transferring to a different post entirely, one that kept her further from the field than she'd originally intended when she first took the job. Her job kept her at a desk most nights, monitoring multiple radio channels simultaneously, coordinating agent positions, and relaying information between patrol units spread across a wide stretch of difficult terrain. It was demanding work in its own way, requiring a kind of constant, low-level vigilance that most people underestimated until they tried it themselves. She had, over 7 years, developed a very precise sense of what normal radio traffic sounded like. Every agent had a particular voice, a particular rhythm to how they called in positions, a particular way of handling stress that came through even over a low-quality radio connection, crackling with static and distance. She could often tell, within the first few words of a transmission, whether an agent's shift was going smoothly or whether something had shifted underneath the routine calm of a standard check-in, a skill that had saved more than one difficult night from becoming something worse. This happened during a routine overnight shift in early spring, an unremarkable night, right up until close to 3 in the morning. Channel 4 was assigned that night to an agent named Whitfield, working a solo patrol along a stretch of border fencing that ran through especially isolated terrain, miles from any paved access road. Whitfield checked in on schedule every 30 minutes, as required. Routine calls, brief and businesslike, exactly the kind of reports she'd come to expect from him over the several years they'd worked overlapping shifts together. Nothing unusual in his voice or his reports for the first several hours of the shift. Nothing that gave her any reason to expect the night would turn out differently than any other. At 2:51 in the morning, precisely between his scheduled check-ins, Adela received an unscheduled transmission on Channel 4. Whitfield's voice, but immediately wrong in a way she couldn't fully articulate at first. Some quality in it that set off a quiet alarm in the back of her mind before he'd even finished his first sentence. He said he had a visual on movement near the fence line, approximately a quarter-mile east of his position. Adela acknowledged and asked for more detail. There was a pause, longer than Whitfield's usual pauses, and then he said something that made her sit up straight in her chair. He said the movement wasn't approaching the fence. It was moving alongside it, parallel, keeping pace with his vehicle. As he drove, Adela asked him to clarify what he meant by keeping pace. Another pause. He said whatever it was matched his speed exactly, whether he sped up or slowed down, staying at a consistent distance from the fence line the entire time, moving through terrain that should have made that kind of consistent pace almost impossible to maintain. Adela told him to hold position and requested backup from the nearest unit, a team working roughly 20 minutes out, her hands already moving across the console to coordinate the response, even as she kept her voice calm and steady over the radio. Whitfield acknowledged, his voice sounding slightly distant, distracted in a way she hadn't heard from him before. Then the channel went quiet, not static, not a dropped signal, which would have registered differently on her equipment. Just silence, the specific quality of an open channel with nobody transmitting, the kind of silence that told her the connection itself was still active, still live, with simply nothing coming through it. Adela tried to raise him again after 2 minutes. No response. She tried again after another 2 minutes, her voice tighter now, professional training keeping the concern out of her tone even as her hands had started to shake slightly on the console. Still nothing. She dispatched every available unit to Whitfield's last known coordinates, declaring an emergency response, standard protocol for an agent going silent mid-transmission during an active observation. The response team reached his last known location 18 minutes later, headlights bouncing across the rough terrain as they closed the final distance, every agent in those vehicles running through worst-case scenarios in their heads without saying any of them out loud. His vehicle was there, engine running, driver's door open, headlights still on and pointed out across the dark terrain toward the fence line, exactly as he must have left it. Whitfield was standing about 15 feet from his vehicle, just standing there, facing the fence, motionless in a way that struck every arriving agent as immediately, viscerally wrong before any of them had even gotten close enough to see his face clearly. Not moving, not responding to his name being called, not reacting in any visible way to the arrival of 2 other vehicles and 3 other agents. It took almost a full minute of calling his name and approaching carefully before he responded at all. The agents exchanging uneasy glances with each other as the seconds stretched on without any reaction from him. When he finally turned to face them, slowly, almost mechanically, his expression was described by every agent present, independently, in nearly identical terms, during their individual statements afterward. Blank, distant. Like someone who had just woken up somewhere they didn't remember falling asleep, still caught in the fog of a dream they couldn't quite place, uncertain for a moment whether the people calling his name were even real. He was checked medically at the scene by the responding EMT and cleared for mild dehydration and disorientation. Standard enough findings for an agent who'd spent hours out in the desert, though nothing about the diagnosis fully explained the 18 minutes of silence or the blank, distant expression every agent present had described. When questioned later, back at the station, in a small office with 2 supervisors present and a recorder running on the table between them, Whitfield's account was fragmented and difficult to fully reconcile with the clean, clear transmission Adela had on record, a transmission that showed him fully coherent and alert only minutes before the gap in his memory began. He remembered calling in the movement along the fence. He remembered it staying parallel to him, matching his pace with an unnerving precision that felt deliberate rather than accidental, the kind of consistency that no natural movement through that terrain should have been able to produce. He said at some point he stopped the vehicle to get a better look, unable to explain afterward exactly why that had seemed like the right decision at the time. He said he got out. Beyond that, he had almost no clear memory until the moment the response team's voices reached him, calling his name, and he realized he was standing in the dark with no memory of walking to where he was standing, no memory of the 18 minutes that had passed, and no memory of whatever had been keeping pace with him along that fence line. Adela told me the transmission itself was reviewed extensively afterward, pulled and analyzed by supervisors, trying to piece together exactly what had happened during those 18 missing minutes. The recording confirmed everything she remembered, his voice, describing the movement, the pause, and then the silence. She listened to that recording more times than she would ever admit to anyone at the station, alone at home, on her own equipment, trying to identify exactly what it was about his tone that had unsettled her so deeply in the moment. What she said stayed with her longest wasn't the content of what he said. It was a specific quality in his voice during that final transmission, right before the channel went silent. Not fear exactly. Something closer to recognition, like he was looking at something that made sense to him in a way it shouldn't have. Something he understood on some level he couldn't explain, in the seconds before he stopped transmitting entirely. She said Whitfield transferred to a different sector less than 2 months later, putting in the request quietly and without much explanation, which the station approved without much discussion or pushback. She said she never asked him directly what he remembered seeing, beyond what was already documented in his official statement, though she thought about asking many times over the following months, especially on quiet overnight shifts when her mind had time to wander back to it. She said some things, in this line of work, you learned not to ask about directly, a kind of professional instinct that developed over years spent hearing things over the radio that never fully made sense once you tried to explain them afterward. You just noted that the person asking to transfer away from a specific stretch of fence line usually had a good reason, even if that reason never made it into any official paperwork. And you let them go, and you didn't push for more, because sometimes the kindest thing you could offer a colleague was simply not asking them to relive something out loud that they were clearly trying, carefully and deliberately, to leave behind them. Story 3. The second set of footprints. This particular story was told to me by a man named Garrett, who spent 11 years as a tracker and sign cutter, a specialized role within the broader agency focused specifically on reading terrain, identifying and following footprints and other physical signs left by people moving through remote desert. It was slow, careful, meticulous work, closer to a craft than a typical patrol assignment, requiring a patience and attention to detail that not every agent had the temperament for. Garrett had trained under an older tracker for 2 years before being considered competent enough to work solo, learning to distinguish age and origin of a print with a precision that had taken years to fully develop. Even after 11 years, he considered himself still learning the terrain in his sector. The desert changed, constantly, in small ways, he said, and a good tracker had to keep relearning it season after season, storm after storm, never fully trusting what they thought they already knew. He could read age of a print within a narrow margin of error based on how the sand had settled and shifted since it was made. He could estimate group size, pace, even rough physical condition of the people he was tracking, all from the story the ground told him if he read it carefully enough. This happened during an assignment tracking a group of 6 people who had crossed through a remote canyon system roughly 8 hours before Garrett picked up their trail, working from a report of activity in the area combined with his own careful reading of the initial sign at the canyon entrance. The tracks were clear and consistent across the first several miles of open desert. 6 sets of prints, moving together at a steady pace, the kind of controlled, deliberate movement of a group trying to cover ground efficiently without exhausting themselves too early in a journey that likely still had many miles ahead of it. He could tell from the depth and spacing of the prints that the group was moving with purpose, following what looked like prior knowledge of the terrain rather than wandering blindly, which wasn't unusual for this particular canyon system. About 4 miles into the canyon, Garrett noticed something that made him stop and crouch for a closer look. A 7th set of prints had quietly joined the group at some point, without any clear beginning that he could identify. Not merging in from a side trail or a branching wash, the way a straggler catching up from behind would naturally leave sign in the sand. Just present, suddenly, walking alongside the others as though it had simply always been there from the very start of the crossing, with no discernible point of origin anywhere he could find. He crouched lower, examining the print closely with his flashlight held at a low angle to catch every ridge and detail in the sand. Bare feet. The other 6 sets belonged to people wearing various forms of footwear, sneakers and work boots identifiable by their distinct tread patterns, each one slightly different, the kind of detail that let him tell one member of the group's tracks apart from another's. This 7th print showed no tread at all, just the clear, direct impression of bare skin against sand, toes and arch and heel rendered in perfect, unmistakable detail. He found this strange, but not yet alarming enough to stop and reconsider the entire assignment. People sometimes lost their shoes crossing rough terrain, especially in washes with loose, shifting sand, and continued on barefoot rather than stop and lose valuable time searching for a shoe that might already be buried or swept downstream. He kept tracking, filing the detail away as unusual but explainable, at least for the moment. The 7th set of prints continued alongside the group for the next several miles of canyon terrain, consistent in depth and stride the entire way, matching the group's pace almost exactly despite the considerable difficulty that barefoot travel over that particular rocky, uneven terrain should reasonably have presented for anyone attempting it. No irregular stride that would suggest pain or injury from walking unshod over sharp, rocky ground for miles at a time. No slowing that would suggest exhaustion setting in faster than it did for the other 6, who were, after all, wearing appropriate footwear for the terrain. Just a steady, even, confident barefoot stride, keeping pace with 6 people wearing proper boots and shoes across some of the roughest, most punishing terrain in his entire sector, mile after mile, without a single misstep. About 7 miles into the canyon, Garrett found something that stopped him completely, crouched low over the sand with his flashlight tracing the same section of ground over and over, trying to make sense of what he was looking at. The trail led into a narrow section of wash, walls rising steeply on both sides, a natural bottleneck the group had clearly used, deliberately to avoid detection from above, the kind of terrain feature that experienced crossers often knew about and used to their advantage. The walls here rose maybe 30 feet on either side, close enough together in places that Garrett could have touched both at once with his arms extended. At the exit of that narrow section, the 6 original sets of prints continued on, exactly as before, moving out into more open terrain beyond the wash. The 7th set did not. It simply ended. Not gradually, not the way a print faded out on harder ground or disappeared into brush. It ended completely, mid-stride, at a specific point roughly 2/3 of the way through the narrow wash, with the last visible print showing a complete, clear impression, and then absolutely nothing beyond it in any direction. Garrett stood at that spot for a long time, longer than the assignment strictly called for, running his flashlight over the same few feet of sand again and again, as if a different angle might reveal something he'd missed. He checked the walls on both sides carefully for any indication of where a barefoot traveler might have climbed out, any scuff mark, any disturbed rock or displaced gravel. Nothing. The walls at that section were sheer rock, difficult even for a properly equipped climber with the right gear, essentially impossible for someone walking barefoot to have scaled without leaving any mark or disturbance whatsoever behind them. He radioed his findings back to his supervisor as a matter of routine documentation, describing the 7th set of tracks and their sudden termination in the same careful, factual tone he used for any unusual sign, keeping his own reaction out of his voice as best he could. His supervisor, an older agent with over 20 years in the sector, more time in that specific terrain than almost anyone else Garrett had worked with, was quiet on the radio for a moment before responding. A pause long enough that Garrett checked his radio to make sure the transmission hadn't dropped. He asked Garrett exactly where in the canyon system he was, his voice carrying a note of careful precision that struck Garrett as different from his usual manner, more measured than the casual, easy tone he normally used over the radio. Garrett gave him the coordinates. Another pause, even longer than the first, long enough that Garrett found himself glancing around the narrow wash, though he couldn't have said exactly what he was checking for. His supervisor told him, finally, to continue tracking the 6 remaining sets and complete the assignment as normal, adding nothing further beyond a brief acknowledgement of the report before signing off. Garrett did as instructed. He located the group roughly 2 hours later, moving through more open terrain further along the canyon, where the walls widened out and the going was considerably easier. All 6 accounted for, tired and dehydrated but otherwise fine, relieved to see the agents approaching after what had clearly been a long and physically difficult crossing for all of them. Garrett watched them for a moment before approaching, running a quick count to confirm the number matched what he'd been tracking the entire time. 6 people, exactly as the 6 sets of prints had indicated from the very start of the canyon. When Garrett asked them, through the group's one member who spoke some English, whether they had seen or sensed anyone else traveling with them through the canyon, the response was hesitant, the kind of hesitation that suggested the question had touched something the group had already been quietly discussing among themselves. The man said one of the others, a young woman near the back of the group, had mentioned during the crossing that she felt like someone was walking just behind her left shoulder for a long stretch of the journey, close enough that she could almost feel their presence, even without hearing footsteps. She said she never saw anyone when she looked, no matter how quickly she turned or how carefully she scanned the terrain behind her. But she said the feeling was strong enough and persistent enough that she had stopped looking back entirely after a certain point, because turning around and seeing nothing there had frightened her considerably more than simply not looking at all and letting the feeling remain unconfirmed. Garrett asked, through the same translation, when that feeling had started and when it had stopped, trying to keep the question sounding routine rather than urgent, though his pulse had quickened slightly at what he was hearing. Through the translation, the answer came back that she believed it started shortly after they entered the canyon, right around the time the walls had risen up close on either side of them, and that it had simply gone, all at once, sometime before they reached open ground again on the other side. She couldn't pinpoint the exact moment it had left, only that at some point she'd realized the feeling was no longer there. The way you might notice a background noise had stopped only after several minutes of silence had already passed. Garrett didn't tell her about the 7th set of prints, or where exactly they had ended. It didn't seem like something that would help her, and he wasn't entirely sure what he would even say if he tried. He told me afterward, once he'd had time to sit with it for a while, that he went back to that section of the wash on his own time, off duty, about a week later, driving out on a day when he had nothing scheduled and telling himself the whole way that this was simply professional thoroughness. He wanted to check it again in daylight, with a clear head, in case he'd misread something the first time in the pressure of an active assignment, the kind of second-guessing that happened sometimes even to experienced trackers who trusted their own eyes as much as Garrett generally did. The tracks, of course, were long gone by then, erased by wind and the slow passage of time that reshaped the desert continuously in ways most people never noticed. But he said he found himself standing at that same spot in the wash, at the point where the seventh set of prints had ended, for a long time, longer than he'd planned to, longer than made any practical sense given that there was nothing left there to actually examine, just standing there, the way you stood at a place that had asked you a question you didn't have an answer for, hoping that standing there long enough might eventually make the answer arrive. It never did. Story 4. What the Camera Saw. This is the last story. It comes from a man named Osvaldo, who managed a network of remote surveillance cameras positioned throughout a stretch of extremely isolated canyon terrain, monitoring for movement across a series of narrow, difficult passages that agents on the ground couldn't easily watch continuously, given the sheer size of the area involved. His job involved reviewing footage daily, sometimes hours of it, across dozens of separate cameras, flagging anything relevant for follow-up, and maintaining the physical cameras themselves, which required periodic hikes into genuinely difficult terrain to replace batteries, clean lenses fouled by dust and weather, and adjust positioning as needed when a camera's angle drifted or degraded over time. He had held this role for just under 5 years by the time this happened, and considered himself thoroughly familiar with every camera in his network and the specific terrain each one covered, having personally hiked out to service each unit more times than he could easily count. One particular camera, designated position 11, covered a narrow canyon mouth that served as a natural choke point for anyone moving through that section of terrain. It was a reliable camera, well positioned at a natural choke point, that had captured clear and genuinely useful footage many times over the preceding years. This began gradually, almost imperceptibly, unfolding slowly over a period of about 3 months, the kind of slow accumulation of small details that only became clear in retrospect once he'd had time to piece them together. Reviewing footage from position 11 one evening, sitting alone at his desk with a mug of coffee going cold beside his keyboard, Osvaldo noticed something in the corner of a frame that had captured a group crossing through the canyon mouth around 2 in the morning. A shape, at the very edge of the frame, mostly obscured by shadow and the limits of the camera's night vision resolution, which even at its best, struggled with fine detail beyond a certain distance. Human-like in basic proportion, but positioned oddly, standing motionless at the canyon wall while the group moved past it without apparent awareness of its presence, none of them so much as glancing in its direction. He assumed, initially, that it was simply another member of the group who had paused briefly at the edge of frame and thought little more of it. He noticed the shape again, 3 weeks later, in an entirely different clip that had nothing obviously connecting it to the first beyond the camera that captured it. Different night, different group, crossing through the same canyon mouth, entirely unrelated to the earlier one. Same position at the edge of the frame, same motionless posture, unmoving through the entire duration of the crossing, exactly as it had been the first time he'd noticed it. That second sighting was what prompted him to go back through the footage more carefully, no longer willing to dismiss it as a one-time coincidence or a trick of shadow. He reviewed every single clip position 11 had captured over the preceding 3 months, watching hours of footage in a single sitting, pausing and rewinding at every frame where the canyon wall was even partially visible. He found the shape in 6 separate clips, always in the same relative position, at the canyon wall, just inside the frame's edge, always motionless while whatever group was crossing moved past it. always too obscured by shadow and distance for the camera's resolution to capture any real detail beyond the basic human-like outline. He checked the timestamps carefully, cross-referencing each of the 6 clips against his logs, noting the date and time of each occurrence in a separate document he'd started keeping, specifically for this purpose. The 6 clips spanned exactly the 3-month period he had reviewed, occurring at irregular intervals with no obvious pattern to the timing, no correlation with moon phase, weather, or the size and composition of the groups crossing at the time. What he found most unsettling, once he'd identified all 6 instances and laid them out side by side on his monitor, was something about the consistency of the shape's exact position across all 6 clips. Not roughly the same area, the exact same position, pixel for pixel, as far as he could determine. In every single instance, despite the camera itself having been serviced and slightly repositioned twice during that 3-month window for routine maintenance, which meant the shape wasn't simply standing in a fixed spot relative to the camera's original position. It was standing in the exact same spot in the physical canyon itself, regardless of how the camera's angle had shifted. Osvaldo hiked out to position 11 himself the following week during daylight hours, specifically to examine that section of canyon wall directly, carrying with him a printed still frame from one of the 6 clips so he could try to match the exact spot as precisely as possible. It took him almost 20 minutes of careful comparison, matching rock formations and shadow angles in the photograph to the terrain in front of him, before he was confident he'd located the precise position. He walked the area slowly, boots crunching on loose rock, before he found nothing unusual about the location itself. Ordinary rock, ordinary shadow, nothing that would explain 6 separate appearances of an unidentified figure standing in that exact spot across 3 months of footage. No cave, no recess, nothing that would allow a person to conceal themselves there for any length of time, let alone stand motionless for the duration each crossing took. He mentioned his findings, cautiously and without too much detail at first, to a colleague who had worked camera maintenance in that same canyon system years before Osvaldo took over the role, someone who'd since moved into a different position within the agency, but who still occasionally consulted on technical matters related to the network. The colleague asked him, carefully, in a tone that suggested he already suspected where this conversation was heading, exactly which specific camera position he was asking about. Osvaldo told him, "Position 11. The colleague went quiet for a moment, long enough that Osvaldo wondered if the call had dropped. He said he'd had a similar experience with that exact camera years earlier, before it had even been designated Position 11 under the current numbering system. Back when the whole surveillance network had used a different, more informal way of labeling each unit. He said he'd seen a similar shape in that same footage, at what he was fairly confident, even all these years later, was the exact same spot along that canyon wall, appearing intermittently over a period of several months, in a pattern that had never made any real sense to him, no matter how he tried to account for it, whether by season, weather, or the timing of crossings through that section of terrain. He said he had eventually stopped reviewing footage from that specific camera as carefully as he probably should have, simply because he found he preferred not to look too closely, a decision he wasn't entirely proud of, but one he'd made peace with over time. Osvaldo asked him what he thought the shape was. The colleague said he genuinely didn't know and had made peace, over time, with not knowing. He said the important thing, as far as he was concerned, was that in all the years either of them had monitored that canyon, spanning close to a decade combined between the two of them, nothing had ever happened to any of the groups crossing through it that could be connected to the shape's presence. No injuries near that specific location. No incidents beyond the standard difficulties of the terrain itself. The kind of hardship that came with crossing any remote canyon system regardless of what might or might not be watching from the walls. Whatever it was, he said, seemed content simply to stand there and watch, the way you might watch traffic pass on a street you'd lived beside your whole life, familiar and disinterested at the same time. Osvaldo told me he still manages that camera network, now expanded to include several additional positions added in the years since this happened. He still reviews footage from Position 11 along with all the others, as required by his job, though he admitted there was a period of several weeks after his conversation with the colleague where he found himself putting off reviewing that particular camera's footage until last each day. He told me he has seen the shape 4 more times in the 2 years since his original discovery, always in that same exact spot, always with the same motionless, watching quality to it. He has stopped documenting each individual sighting in any official capacity, since there was never anything actionable to report, but he keeps a private note of the dates regardless, a habit he's never quite been able to break. He said he no longer feels the need to investigate further, or to mention it beyond the occasional quiet conversation with colleagues who already know, the small circle of people within the agency who have, over the years, developed their own understanding of that specific canyon without ever needing to discuss it in detail. He said he has come to think of it, in a strange way, as simply another fixed feature of that particular stretch of canyon, no different in its own way from the rock formations or the seasonal patterns of wind that shaped the terrain long before any of them arrived, something that was there before the cameras and will likely still be there long after every camera in his network has been replaced by something newer. He said the canyon has been used as a crossing point for a very long time, far longer than his agency has existed to monitor it, likely far longer than any agency of any kind had ever paid attention to that specific stretch of desert. People had been moving through that terrain for generations, he said, long before cameras or sensors or any of the modern infrastructure that now watched over it. Whatever wisdom or danger the land itself held had presumably been there the entire time, indifferent to whichever era of technology happened to be recording it. He said he has stopped wondering why something might be standing at that exact spot in the wall, watching everyone who passes through, since that question had never once produced an answer he found satisfying, and started wondering instead how long it has already been standing there, long before any camera was ever there to see it. Subscribe for more late-night stories, a new one every week. 4 agents, 4 stretches of desert. Rolando still checks Sensor 41's logs. Adela still remembers the silence on Channel 4. Garrett still stands in that wash sometimes. And Osvaldo still reviews the footage from position 11. If you work terrain older than the equipment monitoring it, pay attention to what it tells you. Sometimes, it knows more than it should. Good night.